Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And I'm aware that we have a lot of international attendees. My name is Maia Otarashvili. I'm the Vice President of Delphi Global Research Center. Today, I am joined by Robert Hamilton, who is the President of Delphi Global Research Center. We are here to discuss our brand new report that we released just yesterday. We circulated that report. It's about Russia and China and their interests in Africa. I will include that report in the chat box as well, so you can see it. It's also available on our website at www.delphigrc.org. I also want to let you know that this discussion will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. You can just look up Delphi Global Research Center and you can see our YouTube channel there with a lot of really interesting videos. Bob, this is a subject matter you've been studying for a few years now, how Russia and China interact, compete, cooperate in various parts of the world. Many of our audience members have seen and read your book on this topic, which again, I will include in the chat box. If you guys haven't seen it, it is available on Amazon in paperback now. And Bob, congratulations. I understand it was just translated into German and is also available online. So without further ado, let's get into this report. Tell us about this research, your findings, and why the subject matter matters in the first place, how Russia and China interact in Africa and why they're so interested in the continent.
Sure. So thanks, Maia, for the introduction, and thanks to the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command for support of this project. This is actually a project that consists of 4 reports and 4 webinars, all on Russia-China interaction in Africa. This report, this webinar, is sort of setting the stage where we're going to do an overview of how we see their interests as they define them in Africa, what type of influence each wields in Africa, and then how they use what we call, you hear a lot of people in the U.S. government talk about the dime, or the instruments of power, instruments of statecraft, diplomacy, information, military, and economic instruments. We'll do a brief overview of how they deploy those instruments in Africa for this webinar, but then subsequent ones in this series will dive more deeply into the security aspect of Chinese and Russian presence in Africa and into their economic presence and interaction in Africa. So I do have some slides. I'll share my screen. There's always some drama associated with this. So I'll do this as quickly as I can. And if you would, Maya, just let me know when they're up and in slideshow.
It's great.
All right, great. Okay. So first of all, why should we care about what Russia and China do in Africa? I would say there's 3 main reasons. One, their interaction in Africa may have an effect on their overall relationship. In other words, and that was sort of the whole idea of the book project that I did. And Africa was actually the first place I did field research for this book project. And this was in summer and fall of 2022 in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And so the idea that their interaction in Africa will have an impact on their overall relationship, I think, so it bears watching for that reason. Next, of course, it has impact on Africans, countries in Africa, and the populations of those countries. So we should care about it for that reason. And then third, of course, it has impact on how the West and the U.S. define their interests in Africa. So why Africa? Well, first of all, I think you've seen, it's empirically demonstrated over the last decade or so, or even decade and a half, increasing interest and presence by both China and Russia in Africa. The second reason I think it matters, and this is for its impact on their relationship, is they have unequal influence and in some cases divergent goals. And we'll get into that a little more as we walk through the report. But so Africa presents a test case for their ability to cooperate in places where the forces of convergence, or the forces driving their cooperation, maybe aren't as strong as they are in other places. And one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons that the forces driving cooperation in Africa may not be as strong as elsewhere is there is a lighter U.S. footprint there than there is, for instance, in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific. And arguably, the U.S. footprint in Africa is set to get lighter as the Trump administration sort of reorients U.S. national security and foreign policy thinking toward the Western Hemisphere. So other places, especially Africa, I think, are likely to see a reduction in U.S. presence and a reduction in U.S. activity overall. And this is especially true because Africa obviously was a large recipient of U.S. aid. And so as U.S. aid, foreign aid gets cut, Africa stands to suffer probably more than many places. So the light U.S. footprint, the U.S. has been called the binding agent in the China-Russia relationship. So the idea is that where the U.S. footprint is a little lighter, the test to their ability to cooperate may be greater. Okay. So that said, I wanted to look a little bit about I want to talk a little bit about their influence in Africa. So first of all, both of them enjoy I think, a fairly deep reservoir of goodwill for their support of the African liberation movements during the Cold War. And I think this is especially true of Russia because the Soviet Union was an early and consistent supporter of African anti-colonial or liberation movements. And it's especially true of South Africa, where the Soviet Union was a big supporter of the African National Congress. Now, we can talk about whether that support was in good faith or was purely instrumental or transactional. In other words, was Russia supporting anti-colonial movements in Africa because the Soviet Union thought it was the right thing to do, or was it purely a way to try to erode Western influence and a stick to wield against the West, because the West obviously was the colonial, Western states were the colonial powers in many places in Africa. And Western countries, frankly, we have to be honest, were late, especially the US, we're late to turn against the apartheid regime in South Africa, and we're late in supporting South African rule by the ANC, or at least democratic rule in South Africa. So they both enjoy a fairly deep reservoir of goodwill for that reason. Russia's current influence primarily revolves around a couple of things. First are the deployments of the Russian Africa Corps, used to be called the Wagner Group. I would argue that's a double-edged sword. They've been fairly successful at convincing African governments, especially those in the Sahel, places like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, to eject international or Western-led peacekeeping or counterterrorism, counterinsurgency forces and replace them with the Russian Africa Corps. The Africa Corps so far has not had any more success than any of the Western peacekeeping or counterinsurgency, counterterrorism missions, and they've done it at a far higher cost to ordinary Africans. In other words, the Africa Corps is not a scalpel, it's a machete, right? And it kills fairly indiscriminately among terrorists, insurgents, and civilians. And it has also, especially in Mali, had a couple of pretty significant military defeats. So it remains to be seen whether the Africa Corps remains a tool of Russian influence in Africa. The second is Russia's information operations. It has been, especially over the last few years, since the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's been a full-court press by the Kremlin on information operations in Africa, many of which are now AI enabled. And so you've got deep fake videos of African leaders spouting pro-Russian talking points in perfect American accent and English. And so that has become a more recent tool of Russian influence in Africa. China's influence mostly focuses on its security and development initiatives in Africa. And China's presence in Africa and its activities in Africa are very much formalized, institutionalized, and connected to each other in the form of the Belt and Road Initiative, which focuses on tangible projects with direct benefits to populations, on the Global Development Initiative, which is attempting to sort of raise the level of economic development in a lot of developing countries, and then the Global Security Initiative. So China's interaction, or China's presence in Africa, is very much institutionalized and is rationalized. In other words, all these initiatives sort of work together and make sense with each other. So there's a very formal Chinese presence in Africa, and I think there's a clear set of objectives Chinese Communist Party has a very strong idea that security and development are linked, and they're sort of mutually constituting. One leads to the other, which then either bolsters or erodes the first. In other words, security is a precursor or prerequisite for a lot of the Chinese infrastructure investments in Africa to bear fruit in the form of increased economic development and trade. And then development is seen as raising the level of security or bolstering security because more people have jobs and therefore fewer people have time or incentive to try to disrupt or overturn the system. Okay. Let's get a little to how they interact. And again, we're going to go more deeply in subsequent reports into the security and the economic realms here, or the instruments here, but I do want to just look at diplomacy, information, military, and economic presence and interaction by the two, and then see how that plays out on the ground in Africa and what it might mean for their overall relationship. China, in every way, is a larger player in Africa, with the potential exception of the security realm. We'll get into that. But in the diplomatic realm, or with the diplomatic instrument, China has a far larger and more active diplomatic presence. It has embassies in all 54 African countries. Russia, at last count, had embassies in about 39. Even those Russian embassies that exist are often smaller and less active than their Chinese counterparts in a particular country, and smaller sometimes and less active than some of the major Western embassies. Russia's been trying to make up with this sort of lack of a permanent diplomatic presence by a really high tempo of high-level visits. You've had Lavrov has visited, this is especially true since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Russia's diplomatic activity and presence in Africa has ticked up noticeably. And that the reasons for that are, one, to undermine Western attempts to isolate Russia, or to demonstrate that Russia is not isolated and has not been undermined by its invasion of Ukraine, especially in the global South, and also to bolster support among African countries for either supporting or at least not openly voting against or criticizing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think we have to admit that's been fairly successful. If you look at the voting records of African states in the UN on resolutions about Ukraine, Africa tends to have the highest level of abstention, or the highest level of countries voting against resolutions that condemn Russia. Both have sort of settled on South Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as their regional partner or surrogate. There are annual naval exercises with South Africa. Again, South Africa and Russia have a long history of a close relationship that dates back to the Soviet Union's support for the ANC during the Cold War. And I think another reason China and Russia sort of default to South Africa, especially, like I said, in the southern cone, or the southern part of the continent, is that they really both have this hierarchical sense of international order. And the idea is South Africa is the largest and maybe the most powerful country in that part of the continent, and therefore having a good relationship with it will enable good relationships with its smaller neighbors. Whether that's true or not, I think time will tell. They share the goal of undermining Western influence in Africa, diplomatically as well as militarily, economically. I think there's a small divergence here in that Russia is far more willing to cause chaos, to undermine Western influence, to drive the West out. China needs stability for its investments, its infrastructure investments to flourish, and for trade to flourish. And over time, I think we could see China beginning to resent Russia's role as sort of an agent of chaos all over Africa, causing chaos, which it can then benefit from by deploying the Africa Corps to a certain country to then, in some cases, promise to undo the chaos or the instability that Russia itself has contributed to causing. So if we move to, okay. If we move to military presence and military interaction, I would say they have very different goals. China's goal of its security presence in Africa is to protect the trade routes and protect its BRI investments. I think it's fairly simple. Russia's goal is to push out Western militaries, gain economic concessions, especially in the form of resource extraction deals. You see a lot of these security for resources deals among Russia and some African states, especially those in the Sahel. and support regimes that are seen as pro-Russian. It does not matter. Russia's not interested in supporting democracy in Africa. It will work. In fact, I think it prefers to work with authoritarian regimes because, again, it feels like democracy is a messy system. And especially in more weakly institutionalized democracies, I think Russia believes, or the Kremlin believes, that working with an authoritarian regime is just more efficient. And the authoritarian regimes also tend, I think, to be more naturally anti-Western because they all come in for significant criticism from the West for their anti-democratic practices, for their violations of civil rights and things like that. Their security presence or military presence takes different forms. China's is overt, it's acknowledged. China's first foreign military base, so the first base outside of China's borders, was in Djibouti. It's still there. There have been consistent rumors for several years that China may be preparing to open a base in Equatorial Guinea in West Africa, which would make sense given that China is very concerned about security in both the Gulf of Guinea and the Sahel, because those are major export routes. And so, again, one of China's goals for Africa is to make it a key node in a global trading system with China at its center. In order to do that, you need not only infrastructure, you need resource extraction, you need infrastructure to get resources to market, but then you also need stable trade routes that are not beset by terrorism, insurgency, civil war, piracy, the types of things that places like the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Guinea have experienced in the past. And so China is very interested in tamping down instability and building stability in those regions to allow African goods to get to market through Chinese infrastructure. China also has the largest UN contingent on the continent of Africa. There's some 32,000 Chinese peacekeepers that have rotated through it. That's the largest number among permanent members of the UN Security Council. There are several reasons for that, I think. Part is legitimacy. So China can make the claim that it is a contributor to Africa and is a contributor to the UN in Africa. And part is, frankly, just a self-serving goal of, what Beijing would call it is a win-win goal of helping bolster security and stability in Africa to allow economic development and trade to flourish. And again, I've talked about this a little bit, but different regional focus. China very much focused on the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Guinea for its military presence, and Russia very much focused on the Sahel. Final thing I think I would say here is China does have a private military and security contractor presence in Africa, and it's fairly significant. What it does is very different than what the Wagner Group did and what the Africa Corps does. Chinese PMSCs don't generally do regime protection. They don't do counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. So they don't fight. And many of them are not armed. Some are, but many aren't. They're mostly in the business of protecting Chinese infrastructure investments and Chinese just investments in Africa. Okay, economically, and again, when I was doing field research, and just about everyone I talked to in all three countries, South Africa, Ethiopia, and Kenya, would say, look, there's absolutely no comparison between the Chinese and Russian economic presence here in Africa. China is a potential economic hegemon. It's the largest bilateral lender, the largest trade partner for the continent as a whole. It did scale back its BRI lending a little bit to prevent debt distress. There were a number of African countries that were in significant debt to China, and the Chinese did what most lenders have done. So they extended payment terms, in some cases lowered interest rates, or in other cases, they extracted resources as payment for debt that African countries could not pay. What China has not done is seize any of the BRI infrastructure that it has built in Africa. This is something that Western, especially American policymakers, express concern about a lot. It has not happened yet. Always possible, but to this point, China has acted like any other lender in Africa. Russia's economic presence is comparatively negligible, especially compared to China. What it's mostly done is forgive Soviet-era debt to African states. It's got few new loans. and really very little foreign direct investment. What trade it does have is fairly small and it's unbalanced. So it's focused on a few commodities and a few countries. It's a big player in nuclear deals and resource extraction deals. But other than that, it's a fairly minor economic player in Africa. Economically, the regional focus, China mostly south of the Sahara and Russia mostly North Africa, especially Egypt, with which it has several large, it has large nuclear power deals. Okay, so I'll wrap up here, and then I'm very interested to hear questions because I think that's where it gets more interesting. So their main area of convergence of interest in Africa really is their shared goal of eroding Western influence. There's not a lot otherwise that drives them toward overt formal cooperation in Africa, other than this idea that both would be better off if Western influence were eroded, degraded, and probably especially US influence. But they do differ over the means. I mentioned this before. Russia is happy to cause chaos and instability in order to drive out or help drive out Western interests or Western countries. China needs stability, especially over the long term, for its economic investments to flourish. So this is an area where you may see an emerging divergence inside a convergence of interests, if that makes sense. Areas where their interests are clearly diverging is their attitude towards stability. As I said, China needs it, but Russia profits from instability and often foments instability. Arms sales, China is replacing Russia as a main supplier. And you're seeing the Chinese, in some cases, talk to African countries directly about the fact that Russian weapons are not performing that well in Ukraine, about the fact that Russia is having trouble supplying some of its foreign clients because the needs, the Russian defense industrial base is so focused on producing equipment to replace what was lost in Ukraine. So China is acting like a competitor, an economic competitor in terms of arms sales. And then resource extraction, China has normally won, but Russia has really settled upon what's, at least to this point, been a fairly effective means of linking its security and its economic activities in Africa. Again, often it will cause chaos in a country, step in with the Africa Corps, and offer regime protection and peacekeeping missions and get payment in the form of resource extraction. So that's the way Russia is sort of competing with what has, to this point, been a fairly large Chinese advantage in that area. So I would say, in conclusion, to summarize it, I would not call their interaction cooperative or competitive. I just say it's compartmentalized. Both are aware that the other is in Africa. Both are aware that the other has important interests in Africa and is pursuing those. But rather than formally cooperating or competing, each is sort of doing its own thing and staying out of the way of the other. And I think the best way to characterize their interaction there is, this is a quote from a South African scholar that I interviewed during field research. He said, look, what they have is a passive proxy type partnership here in Africa. There's no formal cooperation, but by the same token, they won't stab each other in the back over the next 20 years. So let me leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. I want to tell our audience members that they can use the Q&A feature to send in their questions in writing. That's how we will conduct the Q&A section of this. I can see some questions already coming in, but let me quickly ask one follow-up question. How is this affecting, 54 African nations, Russia sowing chaos, China, trying to protect its interests there, and they're not leaving anytime soon. How is this impacting the African countries themselves, the populations themselves, especially in situations? I mean, we've seen a lot of footage of, I'm sure, even if you don't know much about Russia and China and Africa, you've seen the footage of, either the Wagner guys in various African countries, or little African children singing Russian songs, right? So
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit about, and you did a lot of field research in many of the African countries. So how are they perceived? How is Russia perceived? How is China perceived? And how is this impacting the continent?
Yeah, that's a great question because, of course, anytime we do these, what are the great powers doing in this part of the world? No region of the world is a great power playground strictly, right? These are Africa's a huge continent, 54 countries. It's the largest number of countries, on a single continent. I guess depending upon how you divide Europe and Asia, but nevertheless, um, with huge demographic and economic takeoff potential in the future, but it is beset by some significant problems that tend to be common among a lot of developing states and developing regions. And so I think the best way to answer the question of how has Russian and Chinese presence impacted Africa is to look at the polls of Africans. And the Afrobarometer, I think, is probably the most prestigious and most consistent polling of African publics. And when you look at the Afrobarometer polls, China is the most popular great power. And I think they polled in the last one I saw, they polled about China, Russia, the US, the EU, and then several individual European states like the UK and France, mostly states that had a colonial presence in Africa. China's the most popular great power. Russia's the least popular great power. So I think the shortest answer to that question is look at the polls. Now, elites may have a different perception, but the question, I think that the answer that matters to that question is how does it affect the people of Africa? And the people of Africa seem to be saying consistently through polling, the Chinese presence here is on balance positive. China does come in for some criticism of its environmental and labor practices in Africa. But on balance, Africans that in polls see China's presence as a positive and Russia's presence as a net negative.
Great, thank you so much. We have so many great questions coming in, so let's try to answer them as quickly as possible, so we can get to at least most of them, if not all of them. How concerned are various European allies about Russia-China involvement, investment in their former colonies and their neighbors? That's a great question.
Yeah, hi Nate, good to see you here. Nate's an old friend of mine from CENTCOM. Yeah, that's a good question. I think obviously maybe the French have suffered the most, or France's presence in Africa has probably suffered the most. France led some of the major. There were French led, so under the French flag, peacekeeping missions in Africa, and there were also French led international missions, often under UN auspices. And many of those have been ejected by African governments after some agitation by the Russians. And so I think Europeans are probably European countries, and especially those who have close ties with many African countries like the UK and France, are probably, there's a general concern about Russian attempts to erode their influence and for Russia to profit from that, the degradation of Western influence. And also, I'm sure there's concern about the fact that Russia is in many ways not only not helping the instability and insecurity problems it claims to be fighting, but is making them worse. And Europe is the closest continent to Africa. And if there is widespread instability in Africa, that would probably lead to widespread outmigration from Africa, and Europe is the natural place for people to go. So I'm sure there's concern about that as well. I don't actually see a whole lot of European concern. I could be wrong. I'd love to hear from Europeans on this. I don't see a whole lot of European concern about what the Chinese are doing, especially the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative projects. I think the U.S. is more concerned about those because some U.S. policymakers see the BRI as nothing but a way for China to build military infrastructure or military capable infrastructure around the world. And again, to this point, there's not evidence for that, but it is something that, in other words, there's not evidence that China is doing that now. There may be There may be evidence that that's the plan, but to this point, they haven't put that plan into action. There's probably some mild European concern about that, mostly echoing probably U.S. concerns, if that makes sense.
All right. The next question asks, one hears about active conflict of interest between Russia and China in Sudan and between Saudi Arabia and UAE. Could you reflect on the activities of international players in Sudan?
Ooh, that's a great question, and it's one I'll admit I haven't studied closely. I will say the Sudanese the war in Sudan, I think has actually caused more civilian casualties over the last couple of years than any war, even the war in Gaza or the war in Ukraine. So and I guess it's sort of I don't know, a poignant reminder of the fact that we often forget Africa. We're focused on a war in the Middle East and a war in Europe. There's a war in Sudan going on that's incredibly bloody. And it's not only Russia and China, but also some of the other players, Russia and Turkey, have found themselves on opposite sides of some of these wars in Africa and in the Middle East. And so, frankly, the activities of international players in Sudan are almost negligible, unfortunately, in terms of stopping the civil war. Russia has been in on again, off again military base talks with Sudan. Those have gone essentially nowhere over the last 5 years. But that's something to watch going forward. If Russia does gain a permanent military presence in Sudan, then obviously, well, not obviously, I think then what we need to do is how does China react to that? How does China react to the fact that there's now a Russian base fairly close to the Chinese base in Djibouti? Is that seen as a multiplier, a force multiplier for China? In other words, we have a partner or an ally on the continent with us in terms of military presence, or is it seen as a threat? And frankly, I don't know. And I'm not sure any of us know at this point how China would react to that.
Thank you. Another question asks, which of Russia's incumbent national industry verticals could become exporters to Africa? For example, you mentioned nuclear energy technology. Could a sector such as medical, pharmaceutical supply become an export product, or agricultural equipment? This is a really good question because you talked about how, Russia is very interested in extracting resources out of Africa, and also how Russia has been, struggling with its military equipment exports. So how does this fall into that context?
Yeah, nuclear technology, obviously, that's somewhere where Russia is a big player. It's one of the few economic sectors where Russia is a larger player than China in Africa. In terms of things like pharma and medical, agricultural equipment, it's possible, but I would, and again, I will admit that I'm not an expert in these sort of economic niches of pharma, medical, and agriculture, but I know that one of the criticisms of China since the war in Russia started is that China is exporting a lot of things that Russia could not get, used to get from the West and no longer can. Vehicles, including agricultural equipment, construction equipment, some of which has been used in the Russian war effort in Ukraine. Things like backhoes and bulldozers and things like that are sort of dual use, right? They may have an agricultural or construction use, but they also have a military use. So I say this to say, I think there are natural competitors to Russia in the medical and pharma field, like India is a major player in that field, and natural competitors to Russia in the area of equipment, construction equipment, agricultural equipment. China is obviously a competitor there that probably have a competitive advantage on Russia because they can produce this equipment. First of all, they're not sanctioned, and so they can get the components more easily for a lot of this equipment, especially medical equipment, which would need very capable microprocessors or chips. It would need, in many cases, things like lenses and things like that could only come from the West. The Chinese can get those things more easily than the Russians. The Indians can as well. So I don't really see an entree for Russia in those fields because I think that there are other competitors that just have an advantage.
Right. From your research, do African nations seek out Chinese or Russian investment, or is it Russia and the PRC that come knocking on their doors? That's another good question.
Yeah, I think it's this is unsatisfying. It's a little of both, probably. Many African countries are happy to take Chinese money, especially, but what limited Russian money there is, because it doesn't come with the strings of anti-corruption, human rights, environmental and labor practices, even though sometimes African governments and populations criticize what the Chinese are doing in terms of labor. But what their critique is about them mostly hiring Chinese laborers to do labor in Africa. But the Chinese and Russian assistance doesn't come with the strings that Western assistance does in terms of democracy, anti-corruption, human rights. But I think it's inaccurate to say they don't come with strings, right? If you look at a lot of the agreements that China has signed with African countries, because countries have to sort of formally sign up to the BRI, to the Belt and Road Initiative, and they'll sign an agreement with China to become a BRI, to become a member of the BRI. Every one of those agreements that I've seen and I've read includes one China policy language. In other words, in order to qualify for Chinese assistance, African countries have to promise to recognize the government in Beijing as the legitimate government of China and to not recognize Taiwan and not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But again, for many African countries, that's a much easier pill to swallow than democracy, human rights, and anti-corruption, frankly, for many governments. And so China, I think China is in many ways, a preferred investor. Russia, I think it's it's a few countries and it's a few targeted narrow economic sectors like resource extraction, nuclear energy, that either African countries come to Russia, and especially in the nuclear game, I think often, yes, the Russians are plying their wares in Africa, but a lot of African countries, not a lot, but African countries that do have civilian nuclear programs, many of them will default to Russia because Russia could deliver reactors cheaply, fairly safely, and on time. And that's something that obviously a lot of countries that need power and want to go nuclear, that's what they want. So
that actually takes us really nicely into Don Hill's question. He asks, besides Africa Core, what can Russia offer and what does it get back besides limited extraction contracts and pushing out the West?
I think that's enough for Russia, because those are two huge goals: pushing out the West and eroding Western influence. And we have to understand that Russia is at war with the West all over the world, frankly. It prosecutes that war in different ways. And because it's not prosecuting that war through the Russian armed forces and the Ministry of Defense does not mean that it's fighting. The Kremlin believes it's fighting a war, and it probably believes it's fighting an existential war against the West. We were very late to wake up to that, but you could argue that February 24th, 2022 woke us up, but not every Western country that woke up in February 2022 is still awake to the fact that Russia is waging a war against the West. So in some ways, the resource extraction contracts and pushing out the West are enough, because Russia, first of all, has a very instrumental attitude toward Africa. It sounds cynical to say, but look, I don't believe the Kremlin cares about anything in Africa other than hardcore Russian security and economic interests, period. And Russia's great power status. And by the way, the great power status, and I talk about this a little in the report, this is not an obsession just of Kremlin decision makers. It's an obsession of the Russian people. When Russians are asked consistently in Levada Center polls, and the Levada Center is really the only remaining legitimate public opinion pollster in Russia, they consistently say that Russia's status as a great power is a very important goal, personal goal for Russians. And so those things matter to Russia, and probably that's enough. Now, what in terms of what Russia can offer, I think there's a problem there. I think Russia has a problem going forward, because what we're seeing is the Africa Corps has been very effective in kicking out Western peacekeeping missions, but has been very ineffective in actually establishing peace, and has killed many, many, many African civilians, 5 figures, so well over 10,000. The numbers, at least, the best counts I think that are available indicate that the Russians have killed tens of thousands of civilians since with their Wagner Corps and Africa Corps presence. So I actually think Russia has fairly little to offer the African people writ large. it does, in a very targeted way, have things to offer African elites. And I think that's really one of the major differences between how Russia and China operate in Africa. China, at least, the narrative is win-win cooperation. And what they mean by that is, win for China, win for the country, and win for the people of the country that China operates in. Sometimes it delivers on that promise, sometimes it doesn't. Russia doesn't even really bother with the win-win rhetoric. It's purely about eroding Western influence, protecting regimes that are friendly to Russia.
You mentioned this Chinese narrative about win-win cooperation, and clearly China has a narrative that it wants to kind of spread amongst the African countries about what China is doing there. So this goes into the next question, which is how is China conducting information operations in Africa and in shaping that domain, and how does that compare to Russia?
Yeah, these are great questions.
I know
Yeah.
we're very spoiled by a very active audience. So thank you.
Yeah. Look, so they're both very active in the information domain. When you look at instruments of power, instruments of statecraft, diplomacy, information, military, economic instruments, information is always the hardest one to pin down because it can't be quantified. I mean, it can in certain ways, but I would argue that the things that can be quantified in the information domain are only indirect indicators of their actual sort of use of the information instrument, and indirect indicators of their attempts to build influence. Because what information is about is building influence, right? I would argue those two are inextricably linked. And use of the other tools also is about building influence. But I think information most directly is pointed in that direction. Now, the things you can count, things like Pushkin Institutes, which is the new sort of Russian, and the Confucius Institutes on the Chinese side. So China has been an earlier and more active player in sort of what I would call institutionalized use of information in Africa. So there are more there are more Confucius Institutes in Africa than there are Pushkin Institutes, and they've been there longer. So at least in that sense, China has a lead on Russia in the sort of brick and mortar information instrument. But especially in terms of online messaging, I think the Russians have been at it longer. And they made the switch earlier to what I would call negative messaging. For a long time, China's information operations were designed to build a positive image of China in whatever countries that the Chinese were deploying the information instrument. Russia abandoned that, I would argue, almost a couple of decades ago, and really just started to focus its information activities on undermining the legitimacy, the popularity, and even the stability of Western countries, right? So Russia's is generally negatively focused. China, you're starting to see them switch. Now, I think the Chinese have realized that Russia's been pretty effective in undermining Western legitimacy and Western influence, not only in Africa, but around the world. And frankly, it's easier to knock someone else down than to build yourself up. And so you're starting to see Chinese information operations switch to the Russian model. And now the final thing I would say on that one is Russia has, and I mentioned this in my remarks, has switched to AI. And we have a great report from one of our fellows, Dan Whitman, called A Movie We've Seen Before, that talks pretty extensively about that. And I encourage people who are interested to read it. It talks about how Russia is using artificial intelligence to essentially promote itself and promote friendly regimes in Africa.
Amazing. Dan Whitman actually has a great question for us. Of course he would. And yeah, this is a really important question. It talks about how a lot of Africans take jobs in Russia and then end up at the front lines in Ukraine. Yeah. Can you comment on that? And one, how can, as Dan asks, how can the African governments protect their citizens from that? But two, how prevalent is that? Because we've seen a lot of news stories about this.
Absolutely. if memory serves, the Ukrainian government is saying 14,000, up to 14,000. Again, if memory serves, I'll have to double check that figure. But it's in the thousands of Africans that have been, as Dan says, often on false pretenses, or at least Dan's question implies, have often been lured there on false pretenses, lured there, with the promise of construction jobs or whatever, and end up on the front line in Ukraine. It's clearly illegal. African governments are waking up to this, and you're starting to see some African governments, one, protest, and two, put measures in place to prevent it. But it's not easy to prevent. It's not easy to prevent because the evidence is not easy to prevent. It's happening outside of Africa too. It's happening all over Asia, Central Asia, and other South Asia. You're seeing people lured to Russia on the promise of economic opportunity, and then they throw a uniform on them, put a weapon in their hands, and send them to Ukraine. So it's a real big problem. African governments are waking up to it. They're only now starting to put measures in place to prevent it. But again, it's hard to prevent because, to prevent it, you would have to somehow verify that in advance, before anybody got on a plane, that the job they were going to did exist. And, that's just a lot of work for governments. And frankly, even though the numbers in the aggregate are large for some African governments, there's not enough people probably being lured away for them to spend a lot of time and a lot of resources trying to prevent it, if that makes sense.
I want to acknowledge that Penelope had the same question, so thank you so much. I want to go back up to Noila's question, who's asking about Chinese debt trap diplomacy. In your report and in your presentation, you talked about that a little bit, which was news to me, that China has actually tried to moderate that a little bit because they've understood what a huge problem it has become. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. Our debt trap diplomacy narrative, when I say our, I mean United States, is frankly more inaccurate than accurate right now. Doesn't mean in the future that the Chinese may be a little more draconian in the way they respond to countries in debt distress. But I would say, so look, there's no evidence that up front, the Chinese are trying to entice these countries into signing up for large infrastructure projects, knowing that the country will default and then that China will be able to seize the asset or the piece of infrastructure. Again, I know that's a U.S. concern, and I know that's the part of the U.S. narrative, but there actually is not a lot of empirical evidence that that's happening. The only case in the world, at least that I've been able to find, and I've talked to a lot of BRI experts, people who do nothing but BRI. The only case in the world that even approaches that is there was a port in Sri Lanka that the Sri Lankan government was unable, essentially was in default on the paying back the loan to build the port, and a Chinese port operations company was given a 99-year lease to operate the port. Now, technically, it's a private company. We all know that there's no such thing as a purely private entity in China. So technically, the Chinese government didn't take over the port in Sri Lanka. A Chinese company did. Now, we all know that the Chinese government exercises a whole lot more influence over even private Chinese corporations than, for instance, Western governments do over private corporations. So it's a bit of a concern, but I don't think it's any evidence that the debt trap was sort of the goal all along. The other thing I would say is, so two more things to answer that question quickly. First, as I said in my remarks, China has acted, and I've had African experts tell me this, people who study the BRI, and they say, look, China acts essentially like all the international financial institutions do in the World Bank and other international financial institutions. When a country gets in distress, they do several things. They scale back their lending. You saw the Chinese do that. And then they renegotiate terms. And what China has done is what a lot of the IFIs have done. Extend the payment term, sometimes lower the interest rate, and then also sometimes, and this is a little different, take, in other words, barter forms of payment. Take things out of the ground, take oil, take gas, take gold, take minerals as payment. One thing I would say that is of concern is when the Chinese do renegotiate these agreements, almost always the dispute arbitration clause stipulates that any arbitration will take place in China, in Chinese courts, and that it is binding and final. And so that is something that African countries that do these sort of renegotiated terms of loans to China, that is something of concern, right? Because in exchange for maybe a longer payment term, lower interest rate, what they get is essentially the knowledge that if they do default, a Chinese court will decide the matter, and they'll have the issue will be binding, no appeals possible. So that's obviously of concern.
Great. I'm going to start combining some of the similar
Okay.
questions. And again, thank you everyone for your interest in this topic. And it's really fascinating. Bob, do you think Russia has staying power in the African continent? And then I'm going to combine that with this idea that, with all the isolation, with the sanctions, that Russia tried to switch from Europe to other theaters. And I guess we could argue that's the case in South America too. But Wagner has been one of the biggest enablers of Russia's interests in Africa, but is that still the case? Has Russia switched from Europe to these other theaters? Has that been a successful move?
Yeah. Interesting question. Yeah. Certainly. So I frame this in terms of Russia's great power and entity. And I know I keep coming back to this, but honestly, it really, really, really matters to the Kremlin, and it really, really, really matters to the Russian people, right? All the polls bear it out. The statements of Kremlin officials bear it out. And prior to the war in Ukraine, I think Russia based its sort of identity or status, legitimacy as a great power on its influence in Europe and its influence in Central Asia. Especially in Central Asia, because the 5 Central Asian states, former Soviet republics, and arguably among the 14 non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, they were the ones that were most dependent upon Russia and had the tightest relationship with Russia across the instruments of statecraft or power. So it lost Europe, right? I think it's inarguable, I think, that Russia has lost Europe for a decade or a generation. The idea of Russia being a player and having a role in European politics, European security, the European economy. Europe is almost completely economically decoupled, not as much as we would like to see, but in terms of oil and gas deliveries and trade, Russia has almost bottomed out in Europe. And so I think, as the question implies, Africa has become a more important theater for Russia to assert its great power identity. And again, Russia's attitude toward Africa is instrumental. It is transactional. It is about Russia. It's not about Africa. China's arguably every great power, right, approaches Africa the same way with their own interests in mind. But I think for China, at least you can say China's interest in for China to pursue or defend its interests in Africa also benefits African countries and African populations in some ways. Russia claims that it does. It claims that it can help bolster security. But again, the evidence for that, there's not a lot of evidence for that. So I don't see a lot of Russian staying power, frankly, unless Russia changes its approach. Its approach right now is focused on, again, Africa Corps deployments and information operations. The information operations are mostly designed to bolster friendly regimes and undermine the West. That doesn't really do Russia many favors in terms of its image. And its Africa Corps deployments have not had full success at stabilizing the security situation, and have levied a major cost on African populations in terms of violence against civilians.
Okay, I'm combining a few more questions that ultimately ask, what should the US and the EU do to counter Russia and China and Africa? Should they do anything, and can they offset these influences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that's the question everybody in European and even North American capitals is interested in. Now, I'm cognizant of this series, right? And the work we do for Russia's strategic initiative is very much focused on the view from Moscow. So, the question we're always asking here is, how does Moscow see this? How does Russia see this? How does the Kremlin see this? But to turn it around, and how should Western governments see this? I think our approach to Africa should emphasize things like civil society development, democratic development when it emerges organically, right? I think the days of the U.S. Imposing democracy around the world are over, at least for the foreseeable future. But and frankly, to be fair, you saw this switch arguably occurred between the first and second Obama administrations. If you look at the national security strategies, whereas the second Obama national security strategy was very much about not promoting democracy, but enabling democracy and supporting democracy where it emerges organically. That should be a focus. Economic development, capacity building, regional cooperation. See, and I think if the U.S. and the EU were to really help focus on economic development, political development, civil society development, and regional cooperation is one way that places like Africa and Central Asia can blunt the external influence of great powers by cooperating. You're starting to see that emerge in Central Asia. It's really interesting to watch. And it is a good thing for the governments and arguably for the people of that region. If you were to see a similar phenomenon emerge in Africa, and it is emerging sub-regionally, I think. Africa is just too big, I think, to expect. I mean, there is an African Union, just like there's a European Union, but they're very different types of organizations. And so those are the types of things I would think would be in the best interest of both Africans and Western countries for the West to focus on in Africa.
Yes, and speaking of Central Asian regional cooperation, we do have a great recent article on this, the cooperation of the Turkic states in Central Asia. So I highly recommend you guys check out our website, delphigrc.org, and you'll see that the Central Asia coverage there. And just like Africa, I think Central Asia is another really interesting example of how Russia and China sort of cooperate and compete and influence the region. Another question, can you talk us through any examples of significant conflict between Russia and China in Africa to date? There was an odd story in 2023 regarding a massacre of Chinese miners working at a site in the Central African Republic.
Yeah.
The Chinese embassy had to call in the then Wagner security to rescue the remainder. But there were rumors after the fact that Wagner had actually been the instigators of the massacre. Are there stories like that that stand out to you?
Yeah. Yeah. See, that question points to sort of that incident, which is true. Now, I don't know personally. I've read a good bit about that incident in the CAR, and I know that the Wagner Group was instrumental in rescuing Chinese miners that were attacked by insurgents. What I don't know, and I'm not sure we do now. The next one of these webinars will be from our team that focuses on Wagner Group and Africa Corps. And so that may be a question that they can answer in more detail, but the question of whether Wagner was involved in instigating that. That's the only case I'm aware of where there had been sort of direct on the ground contact between Russian and Chinese interests or, people in Africa. In this case, Chinese miners and the Russian Wagner Group. But in the macro sense, this incident points to sort of a larger potential divergence of interest in China or in Africa between Russia and China. And it gets back to, I've mentioned this a couple of times before, their attitude towards security and stability. It's in China's interest that Africa be stable, that security be at a high level, because China needs stability and security for its economic investments to flourish. It is in some cases in Russia's interest to foment insecurity and instability and then offer the Africa Corps as the answer to that. So I think in the larger sense, that could be a potential source of friction or divergence of interest between them. Again, in the micro sense of this specific incident, I think you'll see more of these actually as Russian and Chinese presence in Africa and activities in Africa could continue to grow, which I think they will. You're likely to see more of these incidents where either they end up helping each other out or they end up coming into conflict. And, when I was researching this book, as one of the people I was talking to said, look, contingency happens on the ground. That's why it makes sense to study how Russia and China interact in place in certain areas of the world on the ground, because sometimes things will happen on the ground that will percolate up and affect the overall relationship. And sometimes these things are due to the decisions of local actors. These are not decisions coming out of the Kremlin or coming out of Beijing. There are people, Chinese or Russian agents on the ground in a certain part of the world that make a decision for their own, sometimes tactical reasons, and then it causes an incident that then percolates up and affects the entire relationship. So definitely bears watching.
Back to the idea of resource extraction, we have a question about Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. How should the West approach these countries because they're strategically very important and critical minerals, especially in terms of uranium in Niger? This is a question from Salim Ali, one of our senior fellows. He says he was in Mali last year and was alarmed by Russian presence there. And yeah, we have a couple of fellows who focus on Russian interests in Mali. This is a pretty fascinating case.
Yeah. So specifically Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, these are in many cases, poster countries for Russian Africa Corps, Wagner, and then Africa Corps influence and operations in Africa. And as I noted, often it takes payment in the form of resource extraction deals, gold, hydrocarbons, minerals. And yeah, Salim, if you were in Mali, and yeah, the Russian presence there is large, and it's mostly in the form of the Africa Corps, and then also extractive industries. But I would argue it is alarming. But I would argue that in terms of Russia's long-term interests and long-term influence, Mali is not going well. Again, we have an article from a couple of our fellows that talks about the Africa Corps being unable to prevent an insurgent fuel blockade of Bamako, of the capital, recently. The Wagner Group or the Africa Corps took a serious military loss about a year and a half ago, I think, to Tuareg militants in the northern part of Mali. And so, and of course, wherever Wagner and Africa Corps go, civilians die in big numbers, right? So I do think it's of concern, but I don't think it's sustainable. In other words, I think 10 years from now, Russia's presence and influence in Mali, as an example, will be less than it is now. Because African governments and African populations I think, are waking up and will continue to wake up to the fact that partnering with Russia has probably more downsides than it does upsides.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are running out of time and we still have quite a few excellent questions. I reviewed them. I think we addressed some of the themes at least, but maybe actually this is a fantastic question, the very last one. So I will ask this. Soviets had the fantasy of combining Europe, Asia, and Africa into Eurasia. Is this a fantasy they're trying to revive? Is it endorsed in Africa? As someone who grew up in the post-Soviet space, I remember seeing some of that old propaganda about this idea of the Soviet Union being so inclusive and so diverse, and especially ethnically diverse, and it definitely did include Africa and African nations. So this is a great way to end the Q&A section. So what are your thoughts on that, Bob?
Yeah, I think that's correct. The Soviets, and not only the Soviets, but the Russians as well. You'll hear Russians talk a lot about Eurasia, this idea of Russia being a Eurasian power, a Eurasian civilization, and something apart from both Europe and Asia, something unique and apart from. At least now, I don't hear Africa included in that as much as you did during the Soviet period. So I think, and maybe sort of modern Russian concepts of Russia, of itself, of its role in the world, are more focused on Eurasia. And this goes back to sort of geopolitical theorizing, right? This is Halford Mackinder, right? The UK geopolitical theorist who argued that land powers are the dominant world powers, and that any land power that that has control of the Eurasian supercontinent. So what Mackinder called the world island, essentially everything from Portugal to Vladivostok or to the Russian and Chinese Pacific coasts. Any power that dominates that space because of its size, population, concentration of resources would be the dominant world power. So there's still a lot of thinking along those lines, not only in the Kremlin, but among Russian academics. And you see that translated into Kremlin policy. Now, I don't think Russia has the capability to become the hegemon of Eurasia, but I do think that's an objective, which is why the Russians have been trying for so long to separate the U.S. from its European allies and partners. To get the U.S. out of Europe has been a long-standing Russian goal, because that enables Russia's objective of being the dominant or a dominant power in Eurasia, in the world island. In terms of is this idea popular in Africa? That's not something I've asked specifically, but I would assume not. I would assume that a continent as large as Africa, with a population as large as Africa, with 54 countries, and with the demographic and economic potential that it has, would prefer to be seen as a subject and not an object of geopolitics. In other words, would prefer to be seen as a distinct region with its own identity, with its own set of interests, and not as some sort of addendum to a larger Russian-dominated region.
Bob, I want to acknowledge Kelvin Wambua's comment. He says, we have always had foreign nationals from Europe, America, and Asia, and Africa, and Kenya in particular. Recently, Russian nationals have become very common, and we actually hear of Kenyans recruited illegally in Russian troops to fight Ukraine. And he asks why the mushrooming. But I hope we were able to address precisely that question, why the mushrooming of Russia in Africa. And we will post the recording of this discussion on our YouTube page for those of you who may have joined us a little late, or for others who signed up but didn't have a chance to join us. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and very much unfortunately, because I think this discussion could have gone on for another hour. I am so grateful to everyone who took the time to tune in, and to everyone who took the time to send in their questions. And of course, Bob, I'm so grateful to you for all the research you did, all the fascinating writing you've done on this subject matter. I'm grateful to the Russia Strategic Initiative at the U.S. European Command, who has made this research possible. This is a fascinating and really timely project that's going to yield at least 3 more reports in the coming months, and more events and more discussions with some really fascinating experts. So I want to ask everyone to keep an eye on our social media channels, on our website, of course, for more of this research and for more upcoming events. We will be talking about the war in Ukraine, of course, because the anniversary of the full-scale invasion is coming up next week. We will also be talking about Russia's frozen assets. We have a long report coming on that topic as well. So keep an eye on our website. We have a lot of new and fascinating research coming up that will be on our website and as part of our Zoom events and podcast discussions. So thank you, Bob, and thank you everyone for tuning in today.
Thanks, everybody.